So what I want to jump into now is the instructor side of the interface. This is actually where things get a little bit more interesting. Actually, I need to look up my account. So the first time that an instructor logs in, they're going to be asked to fill out this demographic data if they haven't already filled this out. And what they're going to see is a list of every section that they're teaching. And so we start off with this student view of the interface because we find that it's important for faculty to be able to see at any given point exactly what the student sees in the course. I know that many learning systems don't give that view. They instead sort of give you a faculty view or a student view. The system tries to provide both, and it tends to run off some problems and generally just make life a little easier on the part of the faculty. I am going to actually use my other instructor account. I just realized I have some better examples set up there. For faculty that are working within multiple institutions, they are going to find that their available course list is grouped by institution. Most of the work that they're going to do, though, is going to end up happening on the staff side of the interface. As you can see, when you hit staff, this is going to pop up a fresh window or a fresh tab. And all of the functionality that you're going to have available as an instructor is going to head over to this left-hand side of the screen. This defines the major pieces of functionality. The first is search. You are able to search out student information. Your search results are going to be limited to only those students for whom you are an instructor. So this continues to protect student privacy. It doesn't give blanket access to everyone. You can break that down to see what are the specific sections in which that student is enrolled. That same functionality is going to be working for you as a mentor, but you're going to end up having a more extensive list of folks that you can do searches upon. When we jump over to the course section, you do need, if you've got multiple institutions, to start to travel down and identify specifically which courses and sections and institutions you want to view. At the end of a semester, sections can be moved to non-active status. This instructor doesn't have any non-active sections. But the goal here is that you can imagine after teaching for a few semesters within the system, you would end up with a huge list of courses that you have access to. Moving them to inactive just really gets them off of your radar, makes life a little bit easier. Drilling down to look at the specific section information, one of the first pieces that's useful for instructors to see is for their specific course version, they're able to see what assessments are available for that course. This is going to let them know how many minutes are allowed for that assessment, how many attempts students are able to make. This also allows for some degree of customization. And again, this is going to vary from course to course. But for exercises and quizzes, we do allow faculty to opt out of these things. What we've learned is that if faculty don't have any sort of opt-out functionality, then they will sort of make up a default opt-out by refusing to grade certain assignments even after students submit them. So if a faculty member opts out, the student will still see the assignment. They'll be able to read it. They just won't be able to submit something. And so this removes the expectation that it's going to be graded and keeps them from cluttering up the system, keeps the instructor from having to see this thing that they're not going to grade. Auto-graded assignments do not have the option to opt out. And we also sort of tried to define what is a core iCarnegie course to the point where it shouldn't be customized any further. And we decided that point is the exam. And so at minimum, a student needs the opportunity to take these tests and take the auto-graded assessments. The rest of these practical assignments, we encourage folks to grade, but do provide mechanisms for opting out. I don't know how well that will map onto expectations for the SDP track. I suspect it will end up being a little bit different from course to course. And one of the places where we see a lot of folks opting out, for example, are these skill builder assignments, which might not be core to the class or on specific exercises or quizzes. In addition to being able to check out the assignments, faculty are able to set a URL. If they have some place where they're keeping course information, they want to publish a syllabus, that type of information, they're able to set their own URL. They can see who's been assigned as personnel for this section, including who's their mentor and who's their instructor. If there are multiple mentors or multiple instructors, it is possible to designate a primary staff person. Specifying that someone's primary doesn't give them any specific privileges or change their role at all. It simply is a mechanism for seeing who is able to who should be contacted and who's sort of leading this effort. Lastly, they are able to jump in and set some exam dates. This is simply a scheduling function. It publishes the information for students to see. It does not restrict access to the exams. It doesn't turn permissions on or off. All that this is a mechanism for students to get a shared expectation of when different kinds of exams are going to be administered. As we continue through the instructor side of the system, you're going to notice that much of the functionality that you see on the left will end up being replicated here in the context-specific pane. What's happening here is that if you're going to select from the functionality below, then the section that you're looking at has already been established. You won't need to reselect it. Whereas if you're going to make use of the menu options on the left, you'll need to reselect your section at each time. The next component is section management, and I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on this. I know that Freddie at the main office is building some pretty extensive videos to cover this. But in brief, this is a mechanism for faculty or for program directors to be able to exercise a little more control over what's happening inside of individual sections. First, by being able to look at the information for them, and also by being able to add or remove students from the section. One of the places that you can do here is check their enrollment status. You can manage the password from here, and you're able to enroll fresh students. The reason that we allow for this functionality on the instructor side is that quite frequently students will add courses at the last minute, and so having a student's information travel from the student information system to the program director to the main office to then have them enrolled often means the student won't have access their first day of class. And so we do give the faculty the ability to jump in and enroll a student, especially if it's a student that's already in the system. Questions on this? And you can see that there are some pieces of functionality that are blocked off from the faculty member.
Does the instructor have the ability to restrict access to the exams? That's just in another section?
Correct.
You said
yeah. So,
okay.
Yeah, that's going to actually fall under the proctoring interface, and I'll talk about that when we get there.
And to get to this this page, you have to. There's an option on the side. Is that how you, when you log in as an instructor, you have the ability to go to this page?
So when you log in as an instructor, oops. When I log in as an instructor, you can see that I've got this staff button that's appearing up in the top.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yep.
No, that's okay. I don't know that I clearly pointed it out. So you do have the staff button.
Yeah, and then you get to that. Okay.
Yeah, and so this will open up this page, and you're then allow you to negotiate through the staff functions as needed. Mm-hmm. Good. Next option, under section roster. What this is going to do is give you a little bit more functionality, including the ability to set passwords for the students. One of the reasons that this is a useful page from the beginning is that if this is a student's first class, then the faculty member is going to need to distribute them their logins and passwords. And so it's sometimes easiest to simply print out this page, rip off strips of paper, and hand each student their own personal enrollment information. You can see that my bogus students each have the same initial password, but normally that initial password is going to be randomly assigned. I'm going to jump over now to the gradebook. And as you can see, we continue to have this pattern, right? I select from the menu on the left, pick the section that I need, and dive in and get the information that I'm looking for. One of the pieces of information that's interesting about the gradebook, as we mentioned, is that it's possible to take assignments multiple times, and this ends up creating a little bit of space for confusion, because in a two-dimensional grid, you've got no good way to show multiple attempts at an assignment. What this means is that faculty will need to select which kind of grade they want to prioritize. You know, they want to see the highest grade, they want to see the first grade, or they want to see the last grade. And that view mode can change as they go. We find that when we try to list the actual names of assessments in this table, it becomes obnoxiously long and more difficult to read. So we end up simply numbering the assignments. Hovering over this will give you the information that you need about them. And from this point, faculty are able to get a quick overview of where a course is headed. They can also drill in on a specific given assignment and see what everyone in the class has done on that assignment. Makes it useful for you to get both a high-level snapshot and then drill down on where people should be and get a sense of where they're struggling. And you can also drill in and see exactly the answers that students are giving and the feedback that they're receiving for each of these sections. Otherwise, the gradebook functionality is actually fairly obvious. Giving about what you'd expect, we can note where students have submitted things that haven't been graded, and this, all of this information can be downloaded as a CSV file. You can also do a highlight and paste into an Excel spreadsheet, which makes life a little bit easier when faculty need to take these numbers and translate them into a grade, you know, based on whatever their individual grading policy is. In terms of how they should be performing that grading, that's actually a conversation you'll want to have with them about individual courses. And you're going to find that different types of grading policies will encourage students to prioritize or not prioritize different types of assignments. So you want to make sure that how a grade is calculated is going to be done in a way that will really encourage good behavior. Within all of the views that we've seen so far, you'll notice one of the options is the ungraded questions button. And so one of the things that needs to happen within this system is the ability to go in and grade. Not so much for the multiple choice questions, but really for the practical assignments. We try to set this up in a way that's going to be reasonably intuitive and also fairly easy. I think that one of the hallmarks of iCarnegie's approach to software education is the notion that one learns how to develop software by actually creating code and by getting feedback on that. To facilitate that, though, is difficult because you know, faculty generally have more students than they like, and they're not able to give a lot of detailed feedback and review a lot of code artifacts in a short period of time. And so we try to structure the system in a way that allows them to move through it as efficiently as possible, get areas that are a challenge out of the way, and focus, or excuse me, that aren't a challenge out of the way, and focus only on the places where students are struggling and really actually do need feedback. You can think of the ungraded questions as your grading queue. This is your to-do list. Usually the easiest way to grade with it is to grab on to head down to the NG. What you're going to see are what files the student has submitted, and from this view you'll need to download these by hand. You can see that people are grading in this case on a question-by-question basis. And this sometimes means that you'll want to view the larger assessment if there are multiple questions involved, just to sort of see what the context is for the answers that the students have submitted. But that when you're grading, you are going to drill down and see specifically what are the grading criteria and what needs to happen for this individual question. So I'm going to start that process again. What we're thinking of when we're grading normally is you have some time set aside to work on a specific course section. Drill down there and select the ungraded questions page. Then on a question-by-question basis, you want to open up the question, review the text of it. All of the questions are going to include a grading support and solutions file. This gives you a sample solution that demonstrates, you know, what would be a 100% piece of work. and then actually grade the question. Any of the practical assignments that exist in Trestle have a rubric that's attached, and the rubric is intended to really take care of those areas of common feedback to ensure some consistency in the grading of materials and to aid a little bit in workflow. This is actually a pretty simple assignment. Students are asked to make an HTML page, and so in most cases for these kinds of simple assignments, you're actually able to ascertain that they're correct or wrong pretty quickly. And so for those cases, we do have a quick score. You can look over the page and see that it looks right. You can quickly mark it off as good. Or similarly, if they've done something that just clearly violates the rules of the assignment, mark it off and move forward. Most of the time, though, you're not able to do that. You're going to need to dig in and get a little more information. And so, when that's the case, this also usually corresponds to having a more sophisticated or thoughtful rubric. So what you're looking at in this case is a rubric that's got a number of tabs, and each of these tabs is associated with some specific grading criteria, some chunk of material that works well together and is structured in a way that this is how you would want to approach the grading of an assignment. From a mentor's point of view, you want to actually think about this stuff and notice places where the rubric doesn't support efficient workflow, because this is one of the places where you can actually give some feedback back into the development team and make sure that what's being developed really does help the faculty as they work through this. Sort of imagine then that the first thing you do when you're looking at this is check these specific methods. These are some servlet methods that are needed. From there, you want to evaluate whether the student has effectively obtained their user input. Consider how they're going about their constructors, creating and accessing attributes, and how they instantiate their objects, and so forth and so on. The rubric's always going to be specific to the needs of an individual assignment, and at any point, you're able to take advantage of the pre-populated feedback, which really is going to try to capture the most commonly made mistakes and the most commonly given types of feedback. However, my students often are going to manage to find new and unique ways to make mistakes, and so you also have the ability to add on your own specific feedback, whether this is under the specific grading criteria or whether this is for the assignment as a whole. At any point when you're adding on your own feedback, you are able to take advantage of HTML tags if that's interesting to you. And all of the rubrics will also have the ability to do what we think of as instructor-specific feedback. So the reason for this is that we often find that, as I mentioned, students are going to find new and unique ways to botch their code, and oftentimes, they're going to find a mechanism that doesn't fall cleanly under one of these predefined pieces of grading criteria. To that end, we do allow the faculty what is essentially an empty text box with the ability to modify the score in any way that they think is appropriate, up to and including giving 0 points. What this ends up looking like is found here under the render page. Take a quick look, make sure that you're happy with its appearance. Hit submit, and then continue working your way through the assignments. So what we try to balance out here is the recognition that that we do have some specific ideas of what was intended when we built these assignments, and we have some ideas on how they ought to be evaluated, particularly as you prepare for the exam. Recognize that you want to, not have to write out every piece of feedback. If it's something that you type every day, then we want to turn it into something that you can just check off. But we also do want to preserve the ability of the faculty to be more specific and add in the kinds of feedback that's important to them. Questions on this?
These rubrics are specific for each project?
The rubrics are specific for each question that is submitted, and so I think that if each project is treated as an individual question, then they would be a project-specific rubric.
Okay.
And I think, again, they can do a fairly nice job of walking the faculty through how you would like them to grade, both in terms of the workflow, first look at this, then look at this, but also in what you as a course developer consider to be the important pieces of the assignment, right? You demonstrate implicit priority by how many points you're going to suggest they take off. And so what this does is it starts to lend a little bit of consistency across faculty to how assignments are graded. It also gives them a good preparation for how you're going to prioritize things on the exam.
Okay.
And so that's sort of really the basics on the website of grading. Now, part of what happens here that becomes challenging is that, when you're working through a Java assignment, for example, you may end up needing to download 4 files that are part of a larger project, and so you then need to integrate those files with the project, see if they compile, see if they execute, and then get rid of them and do this again for the next student and keep track of who you're currently looking at, who you're currently downloading. So a big chunk of this is, well, what you do on your local machine and how you manage that process. There are some additional tools available to make that process easier, but that piece is one that they've asked that we hold off on talking about. And so right now what you've got available to you is this online grading mechanism using the web.
Okay.
One of the other services that's available, or one of the things that's useful when you think about providing support to faculty, is for them to see what kind of feedback other educators would give for their students' assignment. This is something that we referred to as mentor grading or grading validation, and if it's presented as simply a mechanism for them to see, how do other faculty grade, most of them will recognize this as really an opportunity to compare their work to somebody else's in a pretty non-threatening way. That's what this mentor scoring button does. So it's going to show me specifically for some student that I've graded, are there any pages that a mentor has gone through and done their own scoring of? What this allows me to do is say, okay, I've given an 80% on this as an instructor, but it looks like my mentor gave a 60 on it. Let's open this up and see where the discrepancy is. And so you're able to really drill down and say, okay, here's what the mentor gave, here's the feedback that they gave, and I can compare that to the same page that I've given and say, oh, actually, yeah, he seemed to have noticed that I missed this improper horizontal rule, for example, and has given different kinds of feedback for me. And so faculty will look for this if you tell them to look for it, but it may or may not be a matter of the standard service that you provide. So that's actually really as much a part of the business arrangement that iCarnegie has with the other institutions as it is anything else.
Okay.
Questions on that? I think I'll show you how to do this as a mentor, but it's basically pushing the mentor grade button rather than the grade button. And so in the past, this service was offered by saying, all right, we're going to randomly grade a certain subset of things that you've graded, and you're able to jump in and do some comparisons there. And then finally, for the certification exams, this is going to serve as validating your work. And if we are in a similar enough range, we'll consider that your work is valid, and we'll just assume that the students that you say have passed the test.
Mm-hmm.
2 final pieces of functionality on the instructor side, one which I'm going to suggest you avoid, and one which you're going to need to deal with pretty consistently. So let me start with the one that I think is not one of the most useful. There's this ability to restrict assessments. And the restrict assessment functionality comes out of some specific instructor requests. Specifically, faculty wanted to be able to set a window in which students must complete certain types of assignments, and outside of which they're not able to submit their work. So you can sort of imagine that, if I'm teaching from September 1st to December 1st, I don't want my students to start before that point, and I don't want them to be able to submit anything after December 1st. And so I'm able to set a global limitation for the entire course that says that work can only start after, call it September 9th, and it has to be completed by November 20th. So fantastic. Now my students aren't able to start early and they can't submit anything late. But within the SSD1 class, there are two major components. There is a HTML section and a Java section. And when I'm teaching the HTML section, I don't want them submitting Java. And when I'm teaching the Java section, I don't want them teaching HTML. And so I actually would like to limit their access further. So to do that, I'm able to set additional limitations on individual assignments. So, okay, in this case, we're going to tell all the students that we want this assignment to be completed within these dates. Finally, I might have some student wander in at some point and explain that they've been sick, they need to miss class, they have some other valid reason for needing an extension, and I'm willing to grant them an extension. And so in that case, I'm able to modify for a single student what kind of access they're going to have. Say, great. So we now have three separate limitations on access to work in this class. One for the course as a whole, one for a specific assignment for everyone, and one for an individual student. Mm-hmm. Why I say that this is poor functionality has in part to do with a fairly clumsy user interface, but also because faculty often don't think through the consequences of how they're setting up restrictions. What you're seeing here is that the ability to set restrictions you can do for all students and all assessments. Further, you can set for a specific assessment a limitation for all students, and for one student you're able to limit for a specific assessment. You can imagine pretty quickly that you might start setting up limitations that are in conflict with one another, or you can set up limitations that don't do exactly what you intended. And so we pretty frequently will get faculty writing in and saying, my students can't access these materials and I don't understand why. And when you drill down, you find out that it's because they've actually blocked students from doing any work. They didn't do this intentionally. Mm-hmm. So when you talk them through the use of this interface, you want to advise them to use it carefully. Remember that the more specific exception will override the more general exception. So it goes from most to less to least specific.
Okay.
In the context of any given assessment, if they're not sure if the student would be able to access, a given assignment, then they should test it by selecting the test functionality, picking a date and saying, okay, on August 17th, could the student take this? And the answer is there are no blocks preventing the student from doing the work on August 17th, but there are a number of blocks that would stop the student from doing the work on December 17th. For some of them, it's the global limitation that's across the entire roster. And for this student, it is for this individual limitation. If and when they start getting into some severe limitations and things start locking up, it's often easier for them to just start clearing out the limits. And starting over from scratch. So, see, and I actually just missed one of the limitations already. So when we talk about the restrict functionality, it's built the way it is because this is really explicitly what faculty were demanding. And so there are a few groups of faculty that use it as intended and use it pretty intentionally. But more generally, folks will just sort of stumble into it and think, oh, maybe this will be helpful. The reality is that unless you've got some really good reasons for using it, there's rarely a good reason to use the restrict assessment functionality. The course and its access to it can be done perfectly well without it, and I would encourage folks to avoid doing so. Questions on assessment restrictions? All right. I have then one more thing on this piece of functionality to talk through, and that is the proctoring interface. So we talk a little bit about proctoring before I click on it, and sort of unpack what we intend to do with this. When you're administering an exam in a traditional classroom with pen and paper, quite frequently you'll want to control two different things. One, you want to give different students different versions of the test to prevent cheating. And two, you want to control access by seeing who has permission to start the exam and who doesn't. And so in a paper classroom, you might come in with exam A and exam B. You're first going to distribute this face down to your students. You get exam A, you get exam B. You get A, you get B, you get A, you get B. When everyone has their exam, you then want to give them permission. You may start the test now. The proctoring interface is an attempt to take care of both of those things at once. For many of our assignments, or at least for many of our exams, there are multiple versions of the exam available. And so part of proctoring is being able to assign students specific exam templates, or at least to say, all of you should get the same exam, randomly generated, and this other group of students should get a different randomly generated exam. The second component is for assignments that require permission. This is a mechanism for turning on that permission set. Proctoring is done on can be done for multiple sections at once. And because part of proctoring allows you to assign a template, theoretically proctoring can be done for any assignment, but it doesn't need to be done for most of them. When you look at these assignments, anything with the triple asterisk is something that requires proctoring. So you can see that the exams are things that students will not be able to access if you don't give them explicit permission. So, sorry, this is in a bad state from my last work, so let me add it on here. So we're looking at 4 students, and what I'm looking at is a multiple choice exam. This multiple choice exam, I think, has a pool of 60 questions, and there are 20 questions that are selected from that pool. Generally, as an instructor, I don't want to deal with what the specific subset of questions are that are drawn. I just want to know that different students are going to get a different set of questions. We refer to that specific set of questions as a template. You can do 2 different types of things when using a template. One is to generate a new one, and that is to create a new random test for everyone, or to create a single exam that anyone that you check off will take. Or you can use a test that you had created at a previous time and administered. So the first and easiest scenario, let's create a random exam, let's give it to everyone, and let's proctor them. What we now see is that the exam is enabled for these students. Each of them will receive their own unique test. I decide I've made a mistake. I'm going to disable that access. Now, it may be the case that you don't want to give everyone their own random test. And the reason for this is actually on the practical side of things. For multiple choice questions, who cares? You're not grading it. There's no reason to give them distinct exams. Give everyone their own test, and it protects exam integrity. But on the practical side, if you have to grade 50 students, you don't want to have to grade 50 different exams, right? Ideally, you'd like to grade a single type of exam. But if you want to do a little bit of variation to protect exam integrity, maybe you only want 1 or 2 exam types. In that case, you could create a single new test and give this first version of the test to these students and give a different test to the alternating rows. There are actually 2 distinct steps here then. Step 1 was picking a template. Step 2 was assigning permission. And I've ended up doing that all with a single button, the proctoring button. That's pretty easy to do when you only have 4 students to deal with. But you might imagine that for a class of 30 to 50 students, you probably prefer, if you're going to be assigning different templates and different exams to students, to get that out of the way before class so that you can then walk into class and just turn on permissions. You see that the system does allow that functionality. Let's simply assign these students an exam instance and assign these students a different exam instance. And we now see that these students are in a state of assigned. They have an instance that's assigned to them, but they're not yet able to actually take the test. When I'm ready, when I walk into the class, I can now proctor them, and the assigned state will move to enabled. Faculty will sometimes want to see what the specific exam is that they're assigning or that they've built. You can use the View Template Version button for that, and this will show you the exact set of questions that's being submitted. The last type of assignment that our template that can occur here, and I apologize because I don't have any good examples of these, is what we call the named template. So sometimes the course developers will go through and create a specific subset of questions and then give it a name and tell faculty, okay, this is the retake exam, or this is the new exam, or this is the Java intensive exam, or whatever it is that they want to name it. If any of those templates have been created, they'll also show up under this list. A good example for this, the SSD1 the SSD1 course has like 7 or 8 different exams, and one tells the student to build a home page, and one tells the student to find a cookie recipe, and one tells the student to build a web page about music. And so we end up assigning each of those as a template so that the faculty can go through and quickly say, okay, I want half of my students to have the music template and half of the students to have the cookie template, for example. This really only comes into play when you start to have deep exam pools, and so that will come into cause potential confusion if the majority of the activities that this faculty have are not broadly pooled or have a single question. They're not going to see where a template exists, right? Because they are only seeing one option under this list. This is one of the components that is confusing to explain, but that once you've used it to administer 2 or 3 exams will just seem completely obvious and that you'll stop thinking about after you've worked through it. I think that the intent with it was to really give users the opportunity to pretty well fine-tune what they're doing with exam administration, but for many faculty it ends up giving them too much power, more so than they'd like to work through. Any questions on proctoring?
So typically these tests are given while they're at class, and they're not doing it like online in some other place. When they're given these exams, they're done on the computer in the classroom.
That has been my experience. I don't know what your current customer base expects, but yes, for the SSD curriculum, the assumption was always that students would be in a computer-enabled classroom or a lab, and that faculty would be giving the exam in a face-to-face way. Now, when you're working with instructors that you're training up, you obviously need to be turning on these permissions and assuming that they'll be working remotely, and so there's some degree of trust that's assumed there. But that's sort of natural with faculty anyway. You're assuming that they're going to be, reasonable people that can be trusted to work through the test, and they don't need to be exhaustively monitored. So it's not that the system would stop you from doing distance learning or administering the exam at a remote point. Simply that it was, sort of built with that assumption in place that most students would be taking it in a face-to-face way.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions on proctoring?
No, I'm good. I think I understand it.
Excellent.
I do too. I'm not a college professor, but I think I get it.
Oh. Well, I think this experience of taking a test is a common one to people, and so I think that breaking this down into a metaphor for classroom practice is a pretty easy one. And I say that having tried a couple of different ways to explain this over the years. The one that seems to resonate with people is, okay, this is like what I do when I deal with a paper and pen class and a paper and pen exam.
Well, when I went to vet school, they had all this stuff. They used a system like this.
Okay.
So, at least on the student side, I've been through that.
Well, and I think that's the other side of it, is that as time goes on, this stuff also becomes a lot more familiar to people.